Well, you're an advocate of FTT, or
No.
no? Good.
The UK is going to have absolutely nothing to do with it. Most or many of the financial institutions in some of the countries in the Eurozone would wish that it would go away, but it's politically highly popular. When the European Parliament came to debate it, I think there was a sort of 10-to-1 vote in favour of it. All the NGOs love it. It won't achieve what it is expected to achieve, and it will make the European, or rather the continental recovery, a lot lower than it might otherwise have been. There was quite a good IMF paper looking at the alternatives between the FTT, or the Tobin tax, on the one hand, and what is rather nicely described as the FAT tax, or the financial activities tax, on the other, which is more or less the equivalent of imposing a VAT on banking, which at the moment does not bear VAT, because the financial activities are defined in effect as value added, more or less, in the banking sector. And the IMF came down very clearly on the side of having the FAT tax, and I think that there's a reasonable argument for imposing a FAT tax if you think that the banking sector and the financial sector ought to bear a larger share of the total tax stake. I think that the FAT tax is acceptable. The FTT, in my view, will be a disaster and won't last long.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It seems to be a tax, by definition, on velocity. So the chances that it will create some form of displacement of where capital resides is going to ultimately be passed on to end users, I think, is pretty high. I would also, I'm a fervent European federalist, so I would carry with that statement. The only justification I see of this tax, as in carbon taxation we read on FT today, is if these really represent the first federalist tax basis we have in Europe on which to build, for instance, common issuance. That I could, as a voter, think...
You want to build it on a silly tax, which is kind of sad. I mean,
seigniorage should be the next one.
One principle of taxation is that people try to avoid it. And the easiest thing to avoid is transacting too much. So my bet would be not much revenue.
How do you see the global synchronization? Because what I was
I'm sorry, we need to have other
sorry,
people get
and we're doing
chances.
too much too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Forgive me asking this question. Milton Friedman. But why exactly is inflation so bad? I mean, isn't that a great way to reduce this debt?
I would say ask a German. So inflation is, well, it's a sand in the gears of the economy. It's a transfer from borrowers to from savers to borrowers, which is the whole point. It's a way of defaulting on the government debt along with everybody's private debt. Screws up every private contract. Yours is a deep point. You know, the economic, we kind of don't like inflation, but the first order is just a change of units. That's sort of lesson one. Why do we care about a change in units? But historically, inflation's always come with pretty horrible economic performance. And that's, in particular, you know, the idea of breaking up the euro and how great it would be if we could all just devalue to competitiveness. Well, think about Greece under a broken up euro that's going to inflate a little bit. That's going to mean capital flight, capital controls, isolation. So high and variable inflation has tended historically to be awful. And I'll just leave it at that.
I would just add that unanticipated inflation can help under these circumstances. The problem is it becomes anticipated very quickly. And once it becomes anticipated, it does nothing for you. It just actually makes everything worse.
Well, there's this theorem about the capital levy is a wonderful tax because it's non-distorting, except everybody, the idea is you do it once. Well, nobody ever believes you're just going to do it once.
The question here? We were talking about, you talk about austerity, growth, and stimulus. We note about the Greek experience that austerity has been imposed by the central bank. And they need to increase taxes. What about stimulus? They cannot have any action on their currency because they are bound to the euro. And if they reduce their tax, there will be no austerity. So how the ECB can help injecting some stimulus in the market in Europe with such different tax and labor system?
Can I take a quick stab at that? This may, sound not the exact way the Greeks intend the stimulus, but if you look at the result of the restructuring, they have now no debt amortization for 10 years, and they have an interest bill on 150% debt to GDP of 3% of GDP. So they're paying coupons on their bonds, which we exchange into, of 2%. That's Germany's coupon rate. So if you want to trade off, collecting taxation to pay down interest, service and amortization, or want to deploy the same taxation to alleviating, the cycle's downturn, I think that's what has been just delivered.
But I don't think Greece's problem is inadequate stimulus. I mean, the whole idea that Greece's economy is in the tank because the government only spends, 50, 60, 70% of GDP doesn't ring true. Well, while it's the 138th worst place in the world to do business, they've got state industries, protections right and left. You hand down being a taxi driver from father to son for 5 generations. Devaluation and government spending didn't do a whole lot for them in the 70s, and going back to that doesn't seem. I mean, Greece's problems are micro problems, as I see them, not ones that need stimulus in the first place. But there's plenty of room for, the way to handle the budget is to spend less, not to take very high statutory tax rates that everybody has to bother evading and make them even higher still and drive all businesses out of the country.
One of the problems is that if you're trying to do structural reform, it doesn't necessarily help to have your country in a major depression, because everyone is going to want to hang on to whatever little bit that they could maintain. So it's a horrible problem.
But you can't do it unless you're in a major crisis. Because if you're not in a major crisis and I say, you're going to have to take a cut on that special deal for university professors, you say, no, Lars isn't taking his cut. You need something where we're all in this together if you're going to do a big structural reform.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Maybe in the back.
Yes, I'm Pietro Stopponi. I'm a current student of MBA. You started the conversation saying that one of the major problem of the crisis was the bankers. We have this discussion, all around Europe. And all the companies, if they lose the value, their shares in the market will go down and close. People will sell the shares and the management will go away. We know that banks are protected on that. How can we find a solution that, if banks don't do their work, the management go away or the bank defaults in some way without creating too many problems for people who have the saving inside? Otherwise, we'll have this cycle on and on forever. Thank you.
You want to go first?
I'll always go first. I'm not so sure the problems with the bankers. The central thing we had is a run. And the main problem is preventing bank runs. Now, just making sure, and then the second thing you said was, well, people should not have to worry they put their money in the banks. No, people should worry a lot. If banks were funded by something a lot more like equity and a lot less like first come, first served debt, then there wouldn't be bank runs in the first place.
I agree with a lot of that, and I think that, and one of the problems, as I think was John said, is that we give a tax advantage to debt, and that makes it extremely valuable to equity shareholders to take advantage of the tax shield and increase the leverage to a point at which the return on equity looks wonderful, but the risk to the society as a whole is unacceptable. And one of the things that we ought to do is to try and shift out of giving the incentive to banks to be much more highly levered. And I think it would be better to do that through reducing the tax advantage on debt relative to equity, rather than simply introducing leverage controls which people will try and avoid somehow or other.
But it is funny that we're talking about taxing banks Or at the same time, they're too big to fail, which is a subsidy, and we're giving them the debt subsidy, and we're giving the subsidy of lower interest rates. This is sort of typical thing of government. Oh, we're going to tax the evil bankers, but oh, they're too big to fail, so we got to make sure we subsidize them at the same time.
None of us are consistent. Nor, I'm sure, even in Chicago.
Oh, no.
Okay, I think at this point in time, I would like to thank all three panelists for an excellent discussion, and we'll adjourn to a reception. Thank you very much for attending.